What would you do if sharing your last piece of bread with a starving child changed your entire life forever? Today, I'm telling you the incredible true story of a poor blacksmith in 1875 Arizona who discovered that sometimes the greatest wealth comes from the smallest acts of kindness. Tell me in the comments, where are you watching this story from? And the hammer felt heavier in my hands with each strike against the red-hot iron. My name is Ezekiel Thornfield, though most folks in Red Rock Springs just call me Zeke, and I've been working this forge for near 15 years now. The Arizona sun was beating down mercilessly through the open doors of my smithy, but that wasn't what was making me sweat. It was the gnawing hunger in my belly and the knowledge that I had exactly one piece of stale bread left to my name. 2 years had passed since my beloved Martha died of the fever, and I'd been struggling ever since. Work had dried up something fierce in Red Rock Springs. The cattle drives weren't coming through like they used to, and most of the townsfolk were tightening their belts just as much as I was. Cornelius Blackwood, the town's main supplier, had been demanding cash up front for iron stock, something I hadn't seen in months. I set down my hammer and wiped the sweat from my brow with the back of my sleeve. The piece I was working on, a simple horseshoe for Doc Harrison's mare, would maybe earn me enough for a small sack of flour if I was lucky. My stomach rumbled so loud it echoed off the stone walls of the forge. That's when I heard it, a soft whimpering coming from behind the stack of old wagon wheels out back. I grabbed my water ladle and stepped outside, my boots crunching on the dry desert sand. The October heat was still fierce, even though the sun was starting its descent toward the horizon. There, huddled in the shade of my woodpile, was a small Apache girl. She couldn't have been more than 8 years old, with long black braids and wearing a simple buckskin dress that had seen better days. Her dark eyes were wide, with a mixture of fear and desperate hunger. She looked like she hadn't eaten in days. Now, I should mention that tensions between the Apache and the townsfolk had been running high lately. There'd been raids on some of the outer ranches, and Cornelius Blackwood had been stirring up talk about the Indian problem. When the most white folks in Red Rock Springs crossed to the other side of the street when they saw Apache, and here was this little one, alone and clearly in need. "Easy there, little one," I said softly, the way Martha used to talk to the stray cats that wandered into our yard. "I'm not going to hurt you." The girl pressed herself further back against the woodpile, but she didn't run. Her eyes followed my every movement as I slowly crouched down, making myself less threatening. That's when I noticed her lips. They were cracked and dry, and she kept licking them like she hadn't had water in a long while. I held out the ladle of cool water. "Here, drink this." She stared at the ladle for a long moment, then looked up at my face, searching for something. Whatever she found there must have satisfied her, because she slowly reached out and took the water. She drank it down so fast, I was worried she might make herself sick. "Slow down there," I said gently. "There's plenty more where that came from." While she drank a second ladle more carefully, I studied her situation. Her dress was torn at the hem, and I could see scratches on her arms and legs, like she'd been traveling through brush country. But what really got to me was the look in her eyes, the same look I'd seen in my own reflection these past months. The look of someone who'd been abandoned by the world. I stood up and walked back into the smithy, my mind made up. That piece of bread sitting on my workbench was all I had, and I'd been saving it for supper. My stomach protested as I picked it up, but I ignored it. I'd gone hungry before. I could do it again. When I came back outside, the girl was still there, though she looked ready to bolt at the first sign of trouble. I sat down a few feet away from her and broke the bread in half. The smaller half I kept, and the larger piece I held out to her. "Go on," I said. "You need this more than I do." She looked at the bread like it was a miracle, then up at my face again. This time, I saw something different in her expression, not just hunger, but a kind of wonder, like she couldn't quite believe what was happening. She took the bread with both hands and began eating it slowly, savoring every bite. I ate my smaller piece and tried to make it last, but it was gone all too soon. The girl finished hers and looked up at me with those big, dark eyes. "Aye," she said quietly. I didn't speak Apache, but I knew enough to recognize a thank you when I heard one. I nodded and smiled. "You're welcome, little one." We sat there in comfortable silence for a while, watching the sun sink lower in the sky. I was trying to figure out what to do next. I couldn't just send her off into the desert alone, but I also knew that having an Apache child in town would cause trouble. That's when she surprised me by standing up and speaking again. "Ezekiel," she said, pronouncing my name carefully. "Ayana." She pointed to herself when she said the second name, and I realized she was introducing herself. "Ayana," I repeated, and she smiled for the first time since I'd found her. She said something else in Apache, speaking quickly and pointing toward the hills where the Apache territory began. I couldn't understand the words, but her tone was urgent, like she was trying to tell me something important. "I wish I could understand you, little one," I said, feeling helpless. She seemed to understand my frustration because she held up one finger, then pointed to the sun, then made a gesture like something rising. "Tomorrow morning," I realized. She was trying to tell me something about tomorrow morning. Before I could ask her what she meant, the sound of hoofbeats came from the main street. Ayana's eyes went wide with fear, and she quickly gathered herself up. "Hide," I said urgently, pointing to the back of my property where the brush grew thick. She understood immediately and disappeared into the scrub, just as Cornelius Blackwood rode around the corner on his big bay horse. He pulled up short when he saw me sitting there. "Evening, Zeke," he said, though his tone wasn't friendly. "Thought I smelled something unusual around here." "Just the forge smoke, Cornelius," I replied, standing up and brushing the dust off my pants. He studied my face carefully, like he was looking for signs of deception. "You haven't seen any Indians around here, have you? Old Pete Morrison said he saw tracks heading this direction." "Haven't seen hide nor hair of any Indians," I said, which was technically true. Ayana was hidden. Cornelius nodded slowly, but I could tell he wasn't entirely convinced. "Well, you keep your eyes open. These Apache are getting bolder, and we can't have them thinking they can just wander into town whenever they please." After he rode off, I waited a few minutes before calling softly into the brush. "Ayana, it's safe now." But there was no answer. She was gone, vanished into the desert like a desert spirit. I stood there for a long time, looking toward the hills and wondering if I'd done the right thing. All I knew was that a hungry child had needed help, and I'd given what I could. As I banked the forge fire for the night and prepared for another hungry evening, I had no idea that my simple act of sharing bread would set in motion events that would change not just my life, but the entire relationship between Red Rock Springs and the Apache people forever. Chapter 2. Sunday morning came with a coolness that promised the brutal Arizona heat would soon follow. I'd spent a restless night thinking about little Ayana and hoping she'd made it safely back to her people. My stomach had been growling something fierce since yesterday's shared bread, and I was trying to decide whether to spend my few remaining coins on food or save them for iron stock when I heard something that made me freeze in my doorway. Drums. Faint but unmistakable, coming from the direction of the hills. I stepped outside and listened more carefully. The sound was getting closer, and with it came something else, the soft thunder of many horses moving together. My heart started beating faster, not from fear exactly, but from uncertainty. In all my years in Red Rock Springs, I'd never heard Apache drums coming toward town on a Sunday morning. The sound grew louder, and soon I could make out individual hoofbeats. I shaded my eyes and looked toward the desert, where a dust cloud was rising in the distance. Whatever was coming, it was big. I was still standing there trying to make sense of it all when Mrs. Henderson from the boarding house came running down the street, her skirts flying and her face white with panic. "Zeke!" she called out. "Indians! A whole war party heading straight for town!" Before I could answer, the church bell started ringing. Not the measured toll that called folks to Sunday service, but the rapid, urgent clanging that meant danger. All up and down Main Street, doors were slamming and shutters were being drawn. Men were emerging with rifles and women were herding children indoors. But I couldn't move, because as the dust cloud got closer, I could see that this wasn't a war party at all. At the front of the group rode an elderly Apache man with silver-streaked hair and wearing traditional chief's regalia. Behind him came maybe 20 other Apache, men, women, and children, and they weren't carrying weapons. They were carrying something else entirely. Baskets, clay pots, bundles wrapped in hide, and unless my eyes were deceiving me, that was food they were bringing. The group stopped about 50 yards from my smithy, and the old chief raised his hand in what I recognized as a peaceful gesture. That's when I saw her, little Ayana, sitting proudly on a paint pony beside the chief. When she spotted me, her face lit up with a smile that could have outshone the Arizona sun. The chief said something in Apache, and Ayana slipped down from her pony and ran toward me. The men with rifles were shouting now, telling me to get away from her, but I stood my ground. This little girl meant no harm. I was sure of it. When she reached me, she took my hand and began pulling me toward the group of Apache. "Come," she said in English, the word careful but clear. "Grandfather wants meat." Grandfather. So the old chief was her grandfather. That explained the urgency in her voice yesterday. She'd been trying to tell me she was going home to get help. "Zeke, don't you dare go out there!" Cornelius Blackwood's voice cracked like a whip from somewhere behind me. "Those savages will scalp you soon as look at you." I turned around to see half the town gathered at what they considered a safe distance. Most of them armed and all of them looking ready for a fight. But when I looked back at Ayana's trusting face and then at the peaceful group of Apache waiting patiently in the desert sun, I knew there was only one choice to make. I let her lead me forward. As we approached, the old chief dismounted from his horse with the dignity of a man who'd been leading people for many years. Up close, I could see that his weathered face bore the marks of both wisdom and sorrow. When his eyes met mine, I felt like he was looking straight into my soul. Ayana spoke rapidly in Apache, pointing between me and the chief. The old man listened carefully, nodding occasionally, and I caught the word "ehehe" several times. Then he stepped forward and extended his hand in the white man's fashion. "I am Nalnish," he said in accented but clear English. "Ayana's grandfather. You are the blacksmith who shared bread with hungry child." I shook his hand, surprised by both his grip and his English. "Ezekiel Thornfield, sir. I just did what anyone would do." Nalnish's eyes crinkled at the corners, and I realized he was almost smiling. "No," he said firmly. "Not what anyone would do. What good man does." He turned and gestured to his people, who immediately began dismounting and unloading their pack horses. I watched in amazement as they started laying out food on blankets spread on the ground. Corn, beans, dried meat, fresh bread, clay pots full of stew, and more food than I'd seen in one place since Martha died. My granddaughter came home yesterday speaking of the white blacksmith who gave half his bread when he had nothing, Nalnish explained as his people worked. "She said you were hungry, but fed her first. This is the Apache way, to honor kindness with kindness." I stood there speechless as the Apache continued setting out what looked like enough food to feed the entire town. Behind me, I could hear the murmur of confused voices from the townspeople, and someone, probably Cornelius, was shouting about this being some kind of trick. "Sir," I finally managed to say, This is too much. I just shared a piece of bread." Nalnish placed a weathered hand on my shoulder. "In Apache belief, when man shares last food with stranger's child, he shows spirit of true warrior. Not warrior who fights with weapons, but warrior who fights against hunger and fear with open heart." Yana tugged at my sleeve and pointed to the feast spread before us. "Eat," she said proudly. "For you." The smell of the food was making my mouth water and my empty stomach clench with need, but I hesitated. "What about your people? Won't they need this food?" Apache always have enough when we share, Nalnish replied. This is our teaching, but we hope you will share with us too. Will you sit and eat with Apache family? I looked back toward town, where the crowd was still watching tensely. Then I looked at the kind faces surrounding me, at little Ayana beaming with joy, at the generous feast laid out in my honor. The choice wasn't difficult. I'd be honored to, I said. As I sat down cross-legged on one of the blankets, Nalnish raised his voice and called out something in Apache. A young Apache man who'd been standing with the horses responded by walking toward town, his hands clearly visible and empty. To my surprise, he stopped just close enough to be heard and called out in English, "We invite all people of Red Rock Springs to come and share food with us. Apache way is to feast together in peace." The response from the townspeople was immediate and loud, mostly shouting about tricks and traps and not trusting savages. But I noticed that Doc Harrison was looking thoughtful, and Mrs. Henderson was whispering something urgent to her husband. Nalnish seemed unsurprised by the rejection. "Perhaps someday," he said to me as we began to eat. "Change comes slowly, like seasons, but it starts with men like you, Ezekiel Thornfield." The food was incredible, flavors I'd never tasted before, prepared with care and skill that spoke of generations of tradition. As we ate, Nalnish told me about his people, about the old ways and the new challenges they faced as more whites settled in the territory. In return, I found myself talking about Martha, about my struggles since her death, about feeling lost and alone in a town full of people. "Loneliness is heavy burden," Nalnish said thoughtfully, "but kindness is medicine for lonely heart. You gave kindness to my granddaughter. Today, you receive kindness in return. This is how healing begins." By the time the sun reached its peak, I had eaten more than I had in weeks and felt more at peace than I had since Martha's passing. But more than that, I felt something I hadn't experienced in a long time: hope. As the Apache prepared to leave, Nalnish pressed a small leather pouch into my hands. "Seeds," he explained, "desert plants that grow with little water. Ayana chose them for you. She says the hungry blacksmith should grow his own food." Ayana ran up and hugged my legs tightly, then looked up at me with those bright, dark eyes. "Friends," she said carefully. "Always friends. Always friends," I agreed, my voice thick with emotion. As I watched them ride away, I realized that something fundamental had changed. The gnawing loneliness that had been eating at me for 2 years was still there, but it felt different now, less like a permanent condition and more like something that could be healed with time and the right kind of medicine. But what I didn't know yet was that this was only the beginning. The Apache were about to change not just my life, but everything I thought I knew about survival, community, and what it truly means to be rich. Chapter 3. 3 weeks had passed since that remarkable Sunday, and I was amazed at how much my life had changed. The seeds Ayana had given me were already sprouting in the small garden plot I'd cleared behind my smithy, and just yesterday, Nalnish had returned with 2 of his men to commission horseshoes for their entire herd. Paid in silver too. More money than I'd seen in months, but the real change wasn't in my circumstances, it was in my heart. I was working at the forge, humming one of the Apache songs Nalnish had taught me, when I heard familiar voices outside. I looked up to see Doc Harrison and Reverend Whitmore approaching, both looking serious. "Morning, gentlemen," I called out, setting down my hammer. "What brings you by?" Doc Harrison cleared his throat. "We need to talk, Zeke, about what's been happening between you and, well, the Apache." I wiped my hands on my leather apron and stepped outside. "What about it?" "The whole town's talking," Reverend Whitmore said, his voice carrying that tone he used when he thought someone's soul was in danger. "They're saying you've been trading with Indians, eating with them, even learning their heathen songs." "I've been making an honest living and treating people with Christian kindness," I replied evenly. "I thought that was something you'd approve of, Reverend." "It's complicated, Zeke," Doc Harrison interjected. Cornelius has been stirring up a lot of sentiment against the Apache. He's convinced some folks that your friendship with them is somehow putting the town in danger. Before I could respond, the sound of approaching riders made us all turn toward the desert. This time it was a smaller group, just Nalnish, Ayana, and a young Apache woman I hadn't met before. But what caught my attention was that they were escorting someone else entirely, Maria Santos, the Mexican widow who ran a small trading post on the edge of town. Maria looked exhausted and worried, her usually neat appearance disheveled. When the group reached us, Nalnish helped her down from her horse with careful courtesy. "Senor Zeke," Maria said, relief evident in her voice. "Thank God you are here. These good people, they found my son Miguel when he was lost in the desert. 3 days he was missing after his horse threw him." The young Apache woman dismounted and gently lifted a boy of about 10 from her horse. Miguel Santos was conscious but clearly weak, his lips cracked from dehydration and his clothes torn from thorns. "The Apache, they saved his life," Maria continued, tears streaming down her face. "They gave him water, shelter, medicine. And when I had nothing to pay them with, they said only that I should bring Miguel to the blacksmith, who understands Apache honor." Doc Harrison immediately stepped forward to examine the boy, his professional instincts overriding any other considerations. "He's dehydrated and exhausted, but he'll be fine with rest and plenty of water," he pronounced after a few minutes. Nalnish spoke quietly to the young woman, who I now realized must be a medicine woman of some kind. She nodded and pulled a small bundle of herbs from her pouch, explaining something to Doc Harrison in careful English. He listened intently, asked a few questions, and then nodded with what looked like professional respect. "She says these herbs will help restore his strength," Doc Harrison told Maria. "The preparation is actually quite sophisticated." As we helped Miguel into the shade and gave him water, I noticed that a crowd was beginning to gather. Word traveled fast in Red Rock Springs, and soon half the town was watching this unprecedented scene. Apache and white people working together to help a sick child. But not everyone was pleased. Cornelius Blackwood pushed through the crowd, his face red with anger. "What's the meaning of this?" he demanded. "Indians in town again." "Maria, you should be ashamed. Accepting help from savages when Christian folks would have—" "Christian folks did nothing!" Maria snapped back, her grief and exhaustion giving way to fierce anger. "My boy was lost for 3 days, and not one person from this town came looking for him. These savages risked their own safety to save a child they didn't even know." "That's different," Cornelius sputtered. "We didn't know he was missing." "I told you myself," Maria interrupted. "I came to your store begging for help to organize a search party. You said you were too busy with inventory." The crowd fell silent. I could see the shame on several faces, including Reverend Whitmore's. The truth was hitting home in a way that speeches and sermons never could. Ayana, who had been staying close to her grandfather, suddenly walked over to Miguel and sat down beside him. She pulled something from her pouch, a small carved wooden horse, and placed it in his hands, speaking softly in Spanish. Miguel managed a weak smile and clutched the toy to his chest. "She's giving him one of her treasures," Nalnish explained quietly to the crowd, "to help his spirit heal along with his body." I watched the faces around me change as they took in this simple act of kindness from a child to another child. Mrs. Henderson was dabbing at her eyes with her handkerchief. Even some of the men who'd been muttering about Indian tricks were looking thoughtful. That's when the young Apache medicine woman did something that surprised everyone. She approached Doc Harrison and spoke to him in careful English. "I have knowledge of desert healing," she said. "You have knowledge of white man's medicine. Perhaps we could learn from each other, for good of all children." Doc Harrison looked around at the crowd, then back at her. "What's your name, miss?" "Kachina," she replied. "I am healer for my people." "Well, Kachina," Doc Harrison said slowly, "I think that's the most sensible thing anyone's said around here in months." Cornelius started to object, but his voice was drowned out by an unexpected sound, applause. Mrs. Henderson was clapping, and one by one others joined in. Not everyone, but enough to make it clear that the tide was turning. Over the next few hours, something remarkable happened. As Miguel recovered his strength, the barriers that had seemed so solid began to crumble. Doc Harrison and Kachina sat together, sharing knowledge about treating desert ailments. Several townspeople approached Nalnish with respectful questions about Apache customs. And Maria, in her gratitude, invited everyone, Apache and white alike, to share a meal she prepared from the supplies in her trading post. As the sun began to set, I found myself sitting with Nalnish, watching our two peoples interact with a wariness that was slowly giving way to curiosity and, in some cases, genuine friendship. "This is how change happens," Nalnish said quietly. "Not with grand gestures or treaties signed by men in distant places, but with one person sharing bread with hungry child, with healers learning from each other, with children playing together." "Will it last?" I asked, thinking of Cornelius and the others who still viewed the Apache as enemies. "Change is like water in desert," Nalnish replied. "Sometimes it flows underground for a long time before it reaches surface. But once it flows, it changes everything it touches." As I looked around at the scene before me, Ayana teaching some of the town children Apache words, Doc Harrison and Kachina deep in medical discussion, Maria serving food to people who just hours ago had been on opposite sides of an ancient divide, I realized something profound had happened. I had started with nothing but a piece of bread and an empty heart. But in sharing what little I had, I discovered something that all the silver in the world couldn't buy. The kind of wealth that comes from building bridges instead of walls, from choosing trust over fear, from understanding that we're all just people trying to survive in a harsh world. The loneliness that had been eating at me for 2 years was finally gone, replaced by something I'd never expected to find again. A sense of belonging to something larger than myself. Not just a town or a tribe, but a community built on mutual respect and kindness. As the Apache prepared to leave that evening, Ayana ran up to me one last time. But instead of saying goodbye, she surprised me with something else entirely. "Next Sunday," she said carefully, "you come eat with us? In our home?" I looked at Nalnish, who nodded approvingly. "You are always welcome at Apache Fire, Ezekiel Thornfield. You are family now." Standing there in the desert twilight, surrounded by new friends and old neighbors who were learning to see each other with new eyes, I finally understood what Martha used to say about God's grace appearing in the most unexpected places. Sometimes the greatest miracles come disguised as the smallest acts of kindness, and sometimes the richest life is the one where you have just enough to share. The bread was long gone, but its legacy would feed 2 peoples for generations to come. Don't forget to like this video if this story touched your heart. Subscribe to our channel for more incredible tales from the Old West, and let me know in the comments what act of kindness changed your life forever. Every Sunday, we bring you stories that prove compassion knows no boundaries.